Welcome back to the 5 p.m. podcast, everyone. I'm Tina, and as always, I'm here with Dan, our resident political enthusiast.
Hey, Tina. And hey, I resemble that remark. But seriously, I'm stoked about today's topic. It's a wild one, even for us.
It really is. We're diving into this proposal by Donald Trump about, get this, annexing Canada. And Steve Bannon's recent comments adding fuel to the fire.
Right? Using time force asterisk, no less. Which, when you think about it, is a whole different ballgame than, say, military action. It's like a hostile takeover, but on a national scale.
Exactly. And former Canadian PM Justin Trudeau, understandably, was not having it. He said it had a snowball's chance in hell, which, I think, perfectly captures the general Canadian sentiment.
Oh, for sure. Most Canadians are not on board. We're talking over 80% opposition, according to some polls. But, and this is where it gets interesting, there's a small but vocal minority who are actually for it.
And that's what I find so perplexing. Why would Times Canadian want this? I mean, we are talking about giving up national sovereignty.
Well, from what I've gathered, a lot of it stems from frustration with Trudeau's policies. It's like, some people are so fed up they're willing to consider, well, anything else.
That's intense. So let's talk about the economic side of this. Bannon's throwing around the idea of these massive tariffs, 25% on Canadian imports. What kind of impact are we talking about?
It's huge, Tina. We're talking about $2.80 times billion times in cross-border trade, times daily. That's cars, lumber, energy, everything. Those tariffs would be devastating.
So basically, Bannon's strategy is to make things so economically painful for Canada that they'd times choose to join the U.S.? Is that even legal?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? From a purely legal standpoint, there's no clear path for something like this now. Neither the U.S. nor the Canadian Constitution has a how-to guide for annexation.
It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. There's no mechanism.
Exactly. We've seen annexations before, like Texas and Hawaii, but those were completely different circumstances, with their own unique political processes. This is something else entirely.
And then there's the whole Arctic sovereignty issue. Bannon's calling it Canada's soft underbelly.
Yeah, that's a big one. With the Arctic ice melting, there are all these new potential shipping routes and resources up for grabs. And frankly, there's been some disagreement between the U.S. and Canada about who controls what.
So it's not just about economics. It's also about geopolitical strategy.
Precisely. Bannon's thinking long-term. He's envisioning this north-south economic and military corridor, with the U.S. essentially controlling the Arctic.
Wow. It's hard to even wrap your head around the implications of something like that.
It is. And, it raises all sorts of ethical questions. We're talking about national sovereignty versus economic pressure. It almost feels like a new form of, economic colonialism?
That's a heavy term, but it's not entirely inaccurate. It's coercion, plain and simple.
Right. And what about the long-term effects? If these tariffs were implemented, we could see major shifts. Auto manufacturers relocating, maybe even cultural assimilation pressures down the line.
It's a slippery slope. And while the chances of this actually happening seem slim right now, the fact that it's even being discussed is concerning.
It is. It highlights these underlying tensions in the U.S.-Canada relationship that we don't often talk about. The trade disputes, the Arctic disagreements, it's all connected.
So what's the takeaway here, Dan? What should our listeners be thinking about?
I think the main thing is to recognize that this isn't just some outlandish proposal. It's a symptom of deeper geopolitical and economic forces at play. And even if annexation is unlikely, the pressures and the rhetoric around it could have real consequences for both countries.
And it's a reminder that even the closest of allies can have significant disagreements. We need to pay attention to these tensions and understand the potential ramifications.
Exactly. It's a complex situation, and it's definitely one we'll be keeping an eye on.
Well said, Dan. And thanks to everyone for joining us for this deep dive into a truly unexpected topic. We'll be back next week with more on the 5 p.m. podcast.